Welcome, students. Today we're going to be talking about political parties. As you can see in the upper left-hand corner, those two symbols represent the two major parties in the United States political system. And down below here in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see some other third parties in addition to the two major parties. The image of the donkey, if you look up here in the upper left again, that is supposed to represent the Democratic Party. And the image of the elephant represents the Republican Party. So from here on out, if you see images or symbols like this, please make those associations. We'll talk to you a little bit more in depth about some of the third parties as well.
All right, so let's look at a little review from what we've already talked about. In the last unit, we mentioned that we don't want to confuse the terms party identification versus versus your ideology. So your party identification is basically just what it sounds like. It's whatever party you identify with. So the party that you typically associate with and vote for, etc. Your ideology refers to your beliefs regarding government and politics and, sort of the proper role of government, right? So there is a relationship, which we'll look at in a second, but the terms are distinct. So, for example, you see here, party identification would be saying that you're a Democrat or you're a Republican or Libertarian, etc. There's also people who are independent, meaning they affiliate with no party in particular, and they vote for different parties depending on the situation. Your political ideology is what we've referred to in the last unit, which is being liberal or conservative or moderate or socialist, things like that, right? And so, again, although these are separate terms, there is a relationship when we look at our political system. So obviously your ideology and your party identification, there will be some overlap as we see here. We know that the Democrats tend to take more liberal positions on a variety of issues. And so it would make sense that liberals, a higher percentage of Democrats consider themselves to be liberal, 50%. And moderate, 35%, and only 13% of Democrats identify ideologically as conservatives. Republicans, as it makes sense, only 5% believe or consider themselves liberal, 25% moderate, and the majority are conservative. In independents, you see not the majority, but a plurality are moderates. And so that makes sense as well. They're sort of in between ideologically, so they may agree with certain positions of the Republicans and other positions of the Democrats, or they may, favor a third party. And so again, there is a relationship, but it's not exactly the same thing. And finally, we see here, as we mentioned in the last unit, most Democrats would fall somewhere between liberal and moderate on the traditional political spectrum, whereas most Republicans would fall somewhere between moderate and into conservative. So our two parties are considered sort of centrist parties in the sense that they don't want to stray too far from the political center. If about 1/3 of Americans, which is about the percentage, consider themselves to be moderate, you don't want to stray too far from the center if you're trying to capture and win those votes and win elections. Now, we have seen Republicans move a little bit more in a conservative direction, I would say, in recent years, and Democrats seem to be moving in a little bit more of a liberal direction. So there may be, sort of at some point, there could be an opening perhaps for a centrist party, but, we'll talk later about how the two parties do a pretty good job of keeping a grip on power.
I would add as well that, be mindful that the political center also shifts over time. In other words, that sometimes the majority of the country does lean more conservative, or the majority of the country does lean more liberal. So the center can be redefined over time as well.
Right, because remember in the article we read recently, Politicians Don't Pander, I told you that, sort of ignore what the author says, because that article was published in 2000. And at the time, the author mentioned that most Americans, something like most Americans tend to be a little bit more conservative than the Democrats on social issues, whereas they're a little more liberal than the Republicans on economic issues. I think that was the comment that was made. And I think, that's no longer true today. So as Mr. Davila said, especially on social issues, many Americans have moved to the left just in that short period of time over the last couple of decades.
So Unit 5 focuses on linkage institutions in particular, and as the name suggests, we're looking at how the people of the United States are linked to their government. There are various entities that help link the people to their government. So we're going to explore this concept quickly before we move any further. So linkage institutions, they're ultimately there to help channel these are channels or structures that allow individuals to communicate and link up with their government in order to get their interest heard and heeded. You can see that in particular, we're going to look at some institutions, and they're going to come up here in the next slide, and I'll discuss how it is that these institutions link the people up to their government. So to begin with, since we're talking about political parties, we can see here that the political parties themselves are institutions. They're organizations that are set up to help, if you will, channel the interests of people and get those interests made into policy ultimately. The goal of a political party, of course, is to get itself elected, but once in office, in order to remain in office or in power, it needs to, of course, pay attention to what its constituents want or what the voters who voted for them want. And so they're there to help make interests into policy ultimately. And they are there in the state level, on the national level, and on the local level. Elections also link people up to their government because they are the way in which the people can register their support for a certain set of ideas or ideals. In theory, when someone casts a ballot for someone, they're not just casting that ballot for the person, they're casting the ballot for that person and the ideas they represent. And so in theory, the persons who win the elections, the candidates, are going to be a reflection of what the people want to see passed and what values they want to see represented in government. Interest groups also link the people to their government. Remember, interest groups, these are a group of people who share a common interest or cause or a couple causes, but they ultimately are there to help lobby Congress and Congress members to get these interests made into public policy. So these groups, of course, exist outside of the formal government structure, but they definitely are very interwoven with the political system because they are going to promise members of Congress money and support in exchange for getting policies they want to see passed and made into public policy. So this sort of relationship we talked about before when we were discussing the legislative branch, if you recall, the iron triangle. Remember that interest groups would typically influence members of Congress, or they would lobby members of Congress by promising them campaign funds. In exchange, the members of Congress would then pass a favorable piece of legislation, and those members of Congress would be in cahoots with some corresponding bureaucratic agency, which would then pass rules and regulations that also favor the interest group and ultimately getting the interest groups what they want. And finally, we have the media. Of course, the media is there as a very essential tool and, if you will, institution that helps to communicate messages to the people regarding what's happening in the government and evaluating the performance of the government, giving the people some sense of the overall functioning of the government, whether or not there are issues that are problematic, or if there are really beneficial pieces of legislation that have had great impact. A lot of the information we get about our government comes through the media, and therefore we are going to have impressions about our government based on how the media portrays the government. So there is, of course, the dynamics we're going to talk about when we get to the media unit. We'll talk about issue framing and what was the other one? Issue framing and agenda setting. Agenda setting, yes, indeed. And so that's going to help sort of give the people a sense for what the government's doing, how well the government's doing. It also lets the government officials know how the people feel about them too, because the media also interviews the people and the public to get a sense for how they feel about the media, right? And then they also use polls to reflect that as well, letting the government know, hey, government, the people are not in support of what you're pushing, or yes, they are increasingly in support, or these groups in particular are seemingly much more supportive of you than these other groups. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but the idea here is that the information that comes from the media here can be used in a variety of ways to affect ultimate outcomes, and we'll talk about that specifically with respect to how political parties use this information when they are crafting their own messages.
All right, so what is a party? So we tried to come up with a definition here, looked at different sources, and anyway, the one we came up with is an organized group of people with similar political goals and opinions who seek to control government and influence policies by helping their candidates win elections at all levels of government. So basically, you have a group of people who generally share similar beliefs, right? So we said ideology does play a role. So people who have sort of a common set of goals or beliefs, and they try to basically get their candidates elected to local, state, and federal office so that they can then implement the policies that they favor, right? So basically, it's a private organization who's trying to essentially do their best to gain as much control and power within the government as possible.
Remember also that one of the key differences between a political party, and we'll talk about interest groups a little bit later on in another PowerPoint, but just remember that interest groups and political parties are not the same thing. They do have interactions with each other, but one of the key differences, if you notice here, is that political parties have similar political goals, plural, and opinions, plural. Interest groups are much more narrowly focused on a single issue or set of goals. And so a political party is more broadly based. It has more overarching and broader goals and a series of goals that sort of bring this group together.
Okay, so in the United States, we call our system a two-party system, as opposed to some other countries, like in Europe, for example. There are multiple countries that have what we'd call a multi-party system. So the main difference is, basically, it's not that we don't have multiple parties, it's that only two parties dominate and win most of the elections. So whereas in a multi-party system, the parties sort of split the vote, into where maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 parties, sort of split the vote, and maybe the winning party would only get 30% of the vote or something like that. So where, different parties actually compete for power, more than two parties, usually several more than two parties actually compete and can, come out ahead. Whereas in our system, we'll look at, there's multiple reasons why we have a two-party system, but that, that's basically, we've always had, not always the same two parties, but we'll look at that in a second. So, but we've always had two dominant parties pretty much.
So you can see here historically that we've had two dominant parties, although they aren't the same parties, as Mr. Phillips already mentioned. And so you can read those for your own, for yourself rather. I do want to just sort of linger on a couple things here. One, you'll notice that the era between, or the time period of 1823 to 1832, you'll notice that it says the era of good feelings. The reason why is because during this time period, most of the country, or there was one dominant party actually, the Democratic Republicans were the dominant party. The Federalists had really fallen out of favor, and they didn't even run a candidate sometimes for the presidency during this time. And to some extent, people were saying was a good time because the country seemed unified. The reality was that there were a lot of factions within the Democratic Republicans, and they didn't always see eye to eye. There were still differences, but it is true that there was one dominant party, and for that matter, it is noteworthy. The Federalists had fallen out of favor for a variety of reasons, but one of the big reasons was because in 1812, the British had invaded the U.S. again. And the Federalists had been very close to the British. In fact, they argued against going to war against the British. And when the British ultimately decided to invade, you can understand that most of the American populace obviously really blamed the Federalists for their positions, didn't obviously see eye to eye with the Federalists on this issue. There were other reasons too, but that certainly did not bode in their favor. Notice that ultimately by 1857, we then get the two parties that we know today, the Democrats and the Republicans, and these are the same parties in terms of name that we have today. I do want to stress, right, look, 1874 to 1912 is known as the golden age of parties. This particular era is interesting because during this time period, this was when the political parties were at the height of their power, meaning that they were the ones that had pretty much lock and control over certain cities or regions. There were these party bosses that basically would control the cities, and they had a lock on power. In other words, Democrats always would win in, let's say, New York City, and Republicans would always win in, I'm just picking random cities here, or Chicago. But the point of the matter is that these parties were such a dominant presence in these cities that people owed their livelihood to them. This was also one of the most corrupt times in our history because of the way in which the parties operated. They operated on a spoil system, basically also a patronage system. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So you would have instances where politicians would promise perks or hand out food or promise money if you voted for them. In exchange for your vote, they'd give you some sort of perk. And clearly this led to a tremendous amount of corruption. We talked about this during the executive unit, if you remember, the executive branch, when we talked about the implementation of the Civil Service Act and why that had to be passed, because how a civil service agent or a person who wanted to be a civil service agent and wanted to get a certain job and didn't get that job went ahead and assassinated the president at that time. So clearly there was a need for change. The other thing I want to note is that Democrats and Republicans, they went through an evolution, if you will. In other words, the Democrats of the late 1800s and early 1900s and the Republicans of the late 1800s and early 1900s are not the same Democrats and Republicans of today. The parties have changed, they've evolved, and they've adapted to the changing times because different issues came to the fore. And the way in which they define themselves also pushed certain demographic groups towards them or away from them. And we're going to discuss that a little bit later. So there are three types of members in the party. You can see there's the governmental party, and I think these titles sort of give away who would be in them, or rather who would be included in them. So in every party, you can imagine you're going to have members who are office holders and who run for office, the candidates. And those are going to be considered the governmental party because these are the people who are actually in government, helping to run government or wanting or hoping to run government. Now, the organizational party, this is where we have the workers and the activists. These are the people who are doing the canvassing. These are the people who are doing the phone calls. These are the people who are organizing the rallies. These are the people who are doing a lot of the groundwork to make these candidates hopefully successful, and also helping the party get their message out and so on. So this is a very essential component of a political party structure, but many of these people are behind the scenes, or they're not on the governmental level. The governmental level is going to be the most visible part of the party, because those are the people you're going to see on TV. Those are the spokespeople for the party. The organizational party is key and important, but unless you're really involved in politics, you probably won't know many of these people. You'll see them out and about because they're out there organizing, but you may not know them as well. So finally, the party and the electorate. And this title sort of literally tells you who these individuals are. These are the individuals in the general population who are eligible to vote and who vote for that party. That's all that we mean by this, party and the electorate. The individuals in society who are eligible to vote, who vote for this party or a particular party. And so that's the party and the electorate. But these three types of members are important to understand, how a party sort of comes to be. Again, the number one goal of a political party is to win elections. So don't forget that. Sometimes students confuse this with trying to pass a particular policy or whatnot. Remember, a political party has many different people, many different views within it. Yes, there's some consensus, but the number one goal of a political party, one in which all the members agree, and that is to win elections. But in order to achieve this goal, parties have to perform a number of essential functions, and we're going to talk to you about that here momentarily.
All right, so one thing that parties do to try to achieve their goal of winning elections is first they have to find quality candidates. So the goal is to sometimes recruit, sometimes people self-select and decide to run for office, but sometimes, local parties and stuff will recruit candidates, or state parties might recruit someone, hey, have you ever, we really think you might make a good candidate for Senate or for this local office. But they also have structures to nominate candidates for political office, which we'll look at more when we study elections. But basically, a lot of states, if there's more than one person seeking that office, right, or more than one person who wants that party's nomination, let's say for a Senate seat or for a governor's seat, then they often hold what's called a primary or a caucus. A caucus could be, mainly we see for presidential election cycle, but primaries are, I think, more common in the states, where people basically run against each other in order to get on the ticket. So you might have 5 Democrats who all want to be governor of Georgia, so they would run in a primary, and the voters for that party would choose, or typically for that party, would choose who they like the best.
Parties also attempt to support their candidates through fundraising and media strategy. This serves a dual purpose. Obviously, the ultimate goal of the party is to get their members elected, but it also allows the party to control or to manage who it is that is going to be part of the greater party. In other words, they may be able to use the fact that they could give you money or could not give you money, or cut advertisements in favor of you or not cut advertisements in favor of you as leverage to make sure that you are in lockstep with what the party leadership wants as well. So this is certainly there to help, if you will, candidates succeed, but it's also there to help the party maintain some control. You can see it also helps the party to control the messaging, possibly. So if the party is putting a lot of money into cutting certain types of advertisements to get a certain message out, As you can see down below, there's some examples. You can get a sense for what the party is really trying to emphasize, and the candidates who are running under that label or under that party label will also get that message, and in theory will echo those sentiments when they're running or when they're cutting their advertisement. So this is one of the major functions and also the impacts that political parties have on the overall process.
Okay, so parties also want to mobilize, energize, and inform their voters about issues. So, parties play an important role, really at all levels, national, state, and local, but oftentimes, the state and local parties really play a big role in terms of, actual get out the vote efforts. And, so they want their voters, they want to identify their voters and make sure they come out and vote on election day. They'll energize them holding rallies or, holding, it could be like a barbecue or a free concert or something, all sorts of things to get voters excited or for a particular candidate, and inform voters about the issues. They can recruit people to canvass, to knock on doors, and say, hey, this person's running and the election's coming up next Tuesday. So-and-so is running for Congress. We hope we can count on your vote, or making phone calls, phone banks, distributing yard signs. There's voter guides that they'll come up with, which I think we have here. So you see, this is happens to be a voter guide. I don't know.
California.
Okay, California. And, they're identifying who they endorse. And so different candidates running for different offices. You can see also they have ballot measures, and they're saying, this is our official position. Our party supports Proposition 1. We don't have a position on Proposition 3, but they oppose Proposition 5, and then some specific ones to their local community. And so it's just, and you'll see some that are more specific, like you might have interest groups also issue these voter guides sometimes, and it could say, these are our pro-choice candidates or pro-life candidates, etc.
And again, this is another way in which the party can maintain some control, right? It helps if indeed you are a Democratic candidate and the Democratic Party says they endorse you. In this example, with Culver City, there were actually 2 Democratic candidates for the U.S. Senate, because in California they have a system set up where the 2 top vote getters are the ones who get to run, not necessarily one from each party. And in the case of California, the Democrats have a super majority there, meaning they are the overwhelmingly dominant party in that state. And so it was actually a race between 2 Democrats. And as you can see, then it would have been especially helpful, perhaps, to get their endorsement, although in this case, the person they endorsed didn't end up winning. It was the other Democrat who ended up winning. So it's not always going to be, if you will, the end-all or be-all if the party endorses you or not. But it certainly helps, and it certainly gives people a sense, especially people who vote for your party, of who the party endorses, and they may be more willing than not to support that person. Sometimes they can actually go the other way, but this is a really important tool that parties can use to help push their particular agenda or get their particular candidates and maintain some control over the process.
So parties are also, educating voters in the sense that if you can go to their websites, there's, websites and Facebook pages and Twitter accounts, all sorts of social media. So the parties are really trying to, make sure they're promoting their message. So people who might be interested and aren't sure how they want to vote, they could, we would hope more people would do this, but go to those websites or check out, well, I want to see where they stand on this particular issue, and so they will publicize where they stand on the issues, and also run advertisements on television, to promote their ideas and promote their candidates. So there's all sorts of ways this comes into play.
Yeah, I think the most common forms here are the political rallies. Those are some of the most visible down here in the lower right-hand corner. And of course, social media and TV advertisements. Those seem to be the dominant ones, really, that the party spends the most time pushing because they usually get the biggest bang for their buck through those. So here we can see that parties also attempt to develop something called a party platform. And what this basically is, it's a formal statement of the political party's principles, objectives, and positions on major issues. So every 4 years, the parties develop a party platform. They do this at the National Convention. We'll talk a little bit about the National Convention in a moment, but suffice it to say it's a gathering of various members of the political party and delegates to nominate officially their presidential candidates. So since presidents aren't elected until every 4 years, rather therefore the party platform won't be developed until the next 4 years. So in other words, it coincides with a presidential election. If that should clarify it a bit. The point of the matter here is the party platform gives general guidance to the voter as well as to its members as to where or what it supports and what positions are important to it. And for that matter, it should reflect what issues are important to its members, right? It's also the people who vote for this party. And so it's a very helpful tool to sort of gauge where a party is, in which direction may it be going, what kind of issues it will be supporting, to get a sense for what kind of policies can you expect this party to pass if they get into power. So it's there to to signal to its own voters, but also to anyone who may be an independent or maybe sympathetic voter from the other party. Hey, these are the issues we think are important. This is maybe how we'd go about achieving these goals. So it's a very helpful tool. But again, it is general guidance, and there can be disagreement. There can actually be very heated disagreement within the political parties over what should be on the platform. And that's because, remember, from the beginning, that party or partisan identity is not the same thing as ideology. There are different ideologies within each party. And so there are going to be differences of opinion and divergence when it comes to what kind of issues the party should center and make a major component of their objectives that they wish to pass in the form of public policy. In particular, this last 2016 election saw divisions both within the Republican and the Democratic parties over what should be in the platform. So it was a very interesting year because we usually don't get to hear very much about this process because it's typically already decided or there's a lot of consensus. But this year there was a lot of division within the parties themselves, a lot of dissension. And so we got to see more of this process play out this year than we would in other years.
Okay, so here you just see, we just want to give you a sample from the Democratic and Republican platform. You can see how they lay out a very different position on guns and gun control. So, we don't have to read this to you, but just to, give you an idea of what the language looks like and basically how the Democrats are much more in favor of limiting guns and putting much, more restrictions in place in terms of purchasing guns with background checks and limiting magazine size, etc. Whereas the Republicans basically see the right to bear arms as a natural right, as an inalienable right, and where they do not typically favor limits on, it says, would not restrict magazine capacity or the ban of semi-automatic rifles, etc. And this this is another example of just some of the planks. I don't know if Mr. Davila said different parts of the platform are called planks. This is more of a some general synopsis of the Republican and Democratic platforms from 2008. You can see they also have a title. You see something very hopeful sounding. America the Beautiful, or Renewing America's Promise, but a lot of these things, are sort of generic in some cases. In general, parties sometimes want to make their positions somewhat vague so that people it sounds like, oh yeah, I support that. Defending our nation, supporting our heroes, securing the peace.
Like, who's against that, right?
Reforming the government to serve the people. It's like, oh, yeah, I kind of actually want a government that doesn't listen to me, or expanding opportunity. Oh no, I really don't want to have a job. I want to just suffer, and I mean, it's just a lot of these things.
They're broad platitudes, right? So, but here's the other thing to note too. You notice the themes, America the Beautiful and Renewing America's Promise, were the very first bullet points thereafter. I told you these happen, they coincide with presidential election years. Typically, the party platform is going to carry a theme throughout it and reflect the priorities or the main message of their presidential candidate that year. So, for example, in 2008, Obama was this young, up-and-coming politician who many found inspiring. And so he also visibly represented change in that he was going to be the first African-American president, and so on. And you saw then that theme or that message be carried into the platform, renewing America's promise, renewing the American dream, because one of the major messages of Barack Obama was hope and change. So you can see this theme carried out throughout the platform. Whereas on the Republican side in 2008, you had John McCain, who was a war hero. So you can see that when he played up his strengths, and so did the platform. And one of those, of course, is that his military service. So that's why you see one of the first bullet points say defending our nation, supporting our heroes, and so on. So the platforms are there also to help reflect and reinforce the messaging and the issues of their presidential candidates as well. So the party influence here carries throughout. We already talked a lot about this during the legislative unit, but I want to stress it again here. But you should already be familiar with the fact that Congress is organized in a very partisan way, if you recall us talking about that. So the organization of government is largely based on party, right? It's very partisan. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is that the major leadership positions and the committees and who leads the committees are all decided by the party. And we should already know that the major leadership positions, the top leadership and frankly, top leadership, the top leadership as well as the committee chairs are all from the major, or if you will, the majority party, the party that won the election. So just remember that as we move along, that there's nothing in the Constitution that says that it has to be organized this way, right? But because the Constitution doesn't forbid it, then the parties take advantage of this fact because they can reinforce their power and their persuasion and their leverage by taking the reins of power of the government and organizing it in a way that benefits them. This also makes it extraordinarily difficult for any third party to sort of gain a foothold, because the two dominant parties are going to make rules and organize government in a way that reinforces their power, right? So you can get a sense for how really important this dynamic is in reinforcing the party's influence.
Okay, so also on this, so the president, you can see in the picture here, when President Bush is meeting with people here who are both Republicans and Democrats, but certainly the fact that there's a Republican president, they're more likely to work closely with also Republican members of Congress, especially if his party has the majority, right? So like with President Trump in his first 2 years, he had a majority of Republicans in the House and Senate, so he really wasn't forced to work as much with Democrats as a president might be if we have, divided government, where the presidents from one party and one or both chambers of Congress are controlled by the other.
Which is going to happen now.
Right, exactly. So in the next 2 years, if President Trump wants to get things done, he will be forced more to work with the Democrats, in the House and in the Senate, because they have a solid, minority of the Senate where they can do filibusters. Also,
they have a majority in the House.
Right, a majority in the House. So the appointment process is also important. Of course, the president, when he appoints judges or cabinet secretaries or ambassadors, he's primarily going to pick almost exclusively people from his own party, right? So with very few exceptions, he's going to pick a Republican president. We'll pick appointees who are also Republican, and Democrats picking Democrats.
So we already discussed this before, where we said the late 1800s, early 1900s, we had these the dominance of the political parties, or the parties were at the height of their power, and there were these political machines in place, which basically refers to an organization that is organized, efficient, but also corrupt. Because if you recall, I told you that the parties were able to maintain discipline and loyalty and allegiance through meting out favors, right? Doling out favors, and also, putting pressure on people or promising them jobs if they were able to get a certain number of people to vote for them. So people in many of these cities and regions literally owed their livelihood in some cases to the political party. So you could imagine how much power, influence that they had. But of course, this led to a lot of corruption, which I already mentioned, and it came to a head when Garfield was assassinated by a civil servant who thought they should have gotten a job. And this led to the passage of the Civil Service Act. So we know that begins the process of dismantling this corrupt system, but it doesn't entirely. We know that political parties still have a tremendous amount of power and hold on the system, even despite the fact that we've seen an increasing number of people become disenchanted or disgusted, I guess some people would argue, but disenchanted and frustrated with the two parties. Despite that trend, they've still been able to hold on to power, and that's a testament to how resilient these organizations are and how pervasive their power is in the system that they have now controlled for quite some time.
Okay, so since the golden age of parties, and with the sort of diminishing or weakening of the party machines, we've seen parties become weaker as institutions for various reasons. So one is what we just mentioned. During the Progressive era, you saw, and even before, I guess the very beginning of that with the Civil Service Act, the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which then says, remember that many positions in the government are based on merit instead of spoils system, instead of, appointing people who are your friends and allies. So with the reduction of patronage, that reduced the power of the party leaders and the president. The growth of primaries, so there was a push for more democracy instead of, a bunch of party leaders, just a few or a group of party leaders selecting a nominee, say for president or for who's going to run for our seat for Senate or governor. Of course, senators used to be appointed themselves, which was also a major form of political patronage. But so the growth of primaries, where the voters pick who should run for that party rather than the party leaders.
Just to clarify, though, here, what Mr. Phillips is referencing is that prior to the 1960s, the political parties would basically determine who would run for various positions by looking to their big fat cats, the big leaders in the party, okay, or within a state. They wouldn't even really pay attention or really listen that much to the voters. But what we saw in the 1960s and also into the 70s was that there was a disconnect between what the people wanted who voted for that party and what the party leaders wanted. And so in order to sort of assuage and to placate their voters, literally the Democratic voters and literally the Republican voters who were becoming frustrated that the party was telling them who was going to run for the party, even though they wanted someone else, they then passed these reforms. And a lot of these reforms sort of came on the heels of various other movements, right? The civil rights movement, but also after the Watergate scandal and so the growing controversy with the Vietnam War. So a lot of the happenings during this period of time, people became less trusting of their government leaders, right? They used to give blind trust to their leaders. And then during this era, it became apparent to them that they shouldn't, or they don't need to, or that they were really flawed. And so the people demanded more say over this system, and the parties acquiesced. And so that's why growth of primaries is important, because now the people who vote for that party have more of a say than just the party leaders.
Right. So sometimes the people will choose someone that maybe the party leaders did not prefer. You saw the party leaders. I'm sure with Trump, the party leader. I think it was just up to the party leaders. I think it's safe to say they would not have picked Donald Trump as their nominee. They would have picked someone more traditional, like a senator or a governor or something like that. And you look at the more mobile population, people aren't as tied to local communities, which also diminishes the impact of the party machine. They can no longer just win over loyal supporters in their local communities. People are mobile, people are moving, and don't have those long-term ties to one place. There's been more laws regulating parties, so that cutting back on the potential for corruption and kind of regulating the way that they do their primaries, things like that. So what are you saying?
Gerrymandering too, right? They're curtailing their ability to.
You would hope. Yeah.
There were some really important laws that were actually passed in this last midterm election, where the people voted for more independent panels to draw the district lines, rather than the parties themselves controlling the drawing process, right? So the parties are going to definitely draw things in a way that give them an overwhelming advantage, even when they don't even have a majority of support in certain states. We've talked about Wisconsin. Well, we will talk about Wisconsin and some other states where the majority of the people in that state are voting for one party, and yet the other party still has a majority by a lot. And so there have been measures taken now where, or laws put on the ballot to be voted on, and overwhelmingly they were successful. And people have chosen for there to be more independence in the drawing process. And I think you can definitely count me as one of those people who believe that that's a virtuous thing. But we'll talk about that later. Nonetheless.
All right. So the idea of candidate-centered politics. So the idea that people used to be more likely to vote straight party ticket and just you could actually check a box. I just want to vote. You could pick up a ballot, in fact, for that party. So they used to you could pick up a Democratic ballot, pick up a Republican ballot, just basically check it and turn it in, and you'd vote for the whole string of candidates from top to bottom for all offices. And now we see more people who say that they're independent. So there's certainly still people who vote almost entirely for all the Democratic candidates in an election, or almost entirely for all the Republican candidates. You do see straight ticket voters, as we would say, but they're with the growth of people who identify as independent. You're supposed to you would see more people vote for the candidate they like the best. So they may split their ticket, meaning they vote for Republican for one office, but then a Democrat for another, and maybe a third party for another, which we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Mr. Phillips mentioned split ticket voters, and it is true that we sort of started out with many people voting straight party ticket, and then we saw an increase in split ticket voting. But it's interesting, recently we've seen a reversion, a going back to straight party ticket voting. And so that's going to be an interesting dynamic to see how it plays out over time. And you'll see a graphic later on that will reflect that. In this graphic, you can see that there are certain trends to note with respect to the percentage of Americans who say they are a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent. And as Mr. Phillips already mentioned, that you've seen a steady increase in the number of persons identifying as independents. As I mentioned in class, Democrats for, at least the better part of a quarter century, right, have enjoyed a registration advantage in terms of more people registering as Democrats than Republicans, and you can see that reflected in this graphic as well. But remember that even though there may be even though Democrats may be more numerous or more in number, the Republican voters tend to be more reliable. They'll come out with regularity and vote. So those two dynamics sort of are at play in each election cycle, and we see then the efforts of the parties also will reflect this, because you'll see some parties tend to want to make voting easier, others want to make it slightly more challenging, or a lot more challenging, and that had definitely come up in this last election cycle. Accusations about voter suppression. Of course, there's also accusations about voter fraud too. So these sort of dynamics are going to play out, and it's also interesting to note what they've done. They've turned certain peoples off to both parties, as you can see then in this graphic, the uptick in the number of people who register as independent. I do want to mention, though, that a lot of these people who say they're independent, they are also what we would call leaners. In other words, there are very few people who are truly independent, meaning that their voting record suggests that they would have a 50-50 chance of voting for either party, that they'd go back and forth. The reality is a good chunk of these independent voters are what we call leaners, meaning they tend to lean more Democratic or they tend to lean more Republican, meaning they vote in ways that are more consistent with the Democrat or more consistent with the Republican, even though they may want to call themselves independent. All right. So you can see here, as I mentioned before, Democrats hold slightly a wider edge in the lean party affiliation than Republicans do here in the 2015-2016. So notice, of those persons who identified themselves as independent, only about 37% of them were truly independent, 33% were in fact Democratic leaners, 26% were Republican leaners. And so you can see how this breaks down accordingly.
I would say, yeah, a lot of people like to say they're independent because they think it makes them sound cool. Like, oh, I think for myself. I'm independent. No one can tell me how to vote. But when it really comes down to it, they're just as reliable for one party or the other as people who just say, yeah, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, right? So when you add in the leaners, you see a Democratic advantage of 50 to 42. And if that's correct, then if people are being honest, because remember, again, they're answering their own preferences, not their actual voting record. Mm-hmm. But that narrows it down to, that leaves about 18% who would be true independence. And we think, right, the real, like Mr. Davila said, if people are really independent, however you would define that, if they're pretty close to 50-50 voting for different parties, for major races, for instance, we would probably see it more like about maybe 15% or 10 to 15%, I would say. Yeah. And those are the people who are really, in a lot of ways, deciding our national elections or our statewide elections in some cases.
Yeah, just a correction. When I initially quoted the independent leaners, I meant to jump down here, and Mr. Phillips had correctly pointed out, of those who identify as independent, right, 50% of them lean Democratic, 42% of them lean Republican, and so on. So the numbers up above just simply represent the percent of voters who identify as Republican, Democrat, or Independent, like the prior slide showed. So I just want to clarify that. All right, so here you can get a sense for party affiliation by state. In other words, which party has a majority or a dominant presence in terms of the number of people registered as that party, or how members in these states usually tend to vote.
How they identify.
Right, or how they identify. And so you can get a sense for those states that are reliably Democratic. Obviously, the deeper the blue, the more solidly Democratic that state would be. The lighter the blue, that means they lean Democratic. And the same is true with the red, right? The more solid red is solid Republican. The lighter shade here of red, which is essentially pink, would be lean Republican. And then those states in gray are those competitive states, which we would consider swing states. They could swing either way. Some of these states are a little more reliably, or I should say, could be tinted a little blue or tinted a little red. But it's also, I mean, it's interesting to note nonetheless, and seeing how these states are going to play out in this next presidential election cycle. It's exciting for Mr. Phillips and I here that, in Georgia, right, that we're a competitive state now, right? So as political enthusiasts or, persons who enjoy politics, obviously, being now on the map as a state that's competitive and that presidents will, or presidential candidates or hopefuls will now probably visit with more frequency than they used to is a pretty exciting thing. But, nonetheless, you can see the layout here.
So, so again, this is a little maybe misleading because you look at a state like West Virginia, or, a state like West Virginia where Trump won by, I think, like 40 percentage points over Clinton. And you say, well, gosh, how did that happen? Well, because a lot of people are still clinging to their old party affiliation. In other words, there's a lot of West Virginia people who probably still say, yeah, I'm a Democrat. I grew up a Democrat. I'm still a Democrat. But at this point, they're voting Republican. But you also see, for instance, well, why, Texas is becoming more competitive, but, why haven't they elected a statewide Democrat, I think, for about 30 years or something, is because, again, a lot of those Democratic leaners or people who consider themselves Democrats may be, for example, Hispanic voters, and we've talked about how they would have lower turnout, whereas a lot of the Republicans in Texas are probably white voters who have, or older voters who have higher turnout. So just because you have an equal number of party identifiers doesn't mean you're going to be winning elections until those people actually start showing up. Okay, so we mentioned this idea of split ticket voting. We're also going to show how this maybe is, is apparently on the decline of late. And so, but the idea of a splitting your, the ticket being like just the list of candidates that you're voting for. And so people might vote, for let's say Republican for president, but then Democrat for your local representative in the House of Representatives. And maybe you even vote for a third party member for some other race. So people splitting their ticket, could help explain, at least in part, why in the past, if you look at the chart or the graph to the right, how we did have more straight blue or straight red lines across in the past. You look at the 1920s and 30s, and then you look at the 1940s and 50s, and you see a lot of solid blue or solid red lines. So again, we call this either unified government, when you have the same party in control of all three of those institutions, the House, the Senate, and the presidency. We don't include the courts, even though we know the courts are political, but the courts at least try to remain, at least on their face, nonpartisan. But so we're looking at the solid red lines would mean both the House, the Senate, and the presidency were all controlled by Republicans, and the solid blue line across shows when the House, Senate, and presidency were all controlled by Democrats. So you see more of a divided government being more the norm than the exception over recent decades. All right. So anyways, that could be one result, or one reason for that could be people splitting their ticket, voting for, say, a Republican president, but then a Democrat for House or a Democrat from their state for Senate.
We're going to see that there may be another reason for this split result of divided government, and that would be structural reasons. We'll talk about that here momentarily. So, as Mr. Phillips mentioned, split ticket voting had increased for a while, and then it seems to have been on the decline, or it is on the decline rather. And that has and maps on with what we know about the ideological spectrum too. We've seen more polarization, right? More people either identifying as liberal or conservative rather than identifying as moderate. So that would suggest then that there's probably less overlap between the party, people who would be voting for, one or the other party, because there's more of a gap between what the parties stand for or what they're pushing for. Whereas before, there may have been, areas where there was overlap in terms of certain issues. Now there's not as much, and so you would probably not see as many people splitting their ticket. And we certainly saw that dynamic play out in 2018, where a majority of states where one candidate, say the Democratic governor of that state won, that almost certainly meant then that the Democratic senator that was running in that state would also win, and vice versa, right? If the Republican governor in that state won, then it almost certainly meant that the Republican senator in that state would win as well, meaning that there wasn't as many people who were choosing a Republican and then a Democrat, or vice versa. Rather, people, if they chose a Republican, they were choosing a Republican straight ticket, or they chose a Democrat, it was a straight ticket voting pattern where they chose all Democrats. And as Mr. Phillips mentioned, I think one of the reasons, or I mentioned frankly, was that there are structural reasons to maybe help explain this split outcome. In other words, how is it that you could still have divided government and have less people voting split ticket? And that's because the Senate and the House are selected in different ways, right? As is the president, for that matter. So the president is not selected by popular vote, right? They're selected by a process called the Electoral College, which we're going to get into much more detail when we get to the elections unit. But suffice it to say that you can have a president who doesn't win the popular vote and then becomes president, like our current president. President Trump did not win the popular vote, but he did win a majority of the electoral votes. So the House of Representatives, which is supposed to be more tightly tied to or closely tied to the popular vote, is more likely to represent where the majority of the people in the country want to be, because that's you get a number of representatives based on how many people you have in your state. So in theory, it's going to roughly approximate the will of the people. Although we know there are problems there too, right? Gerrymandering, we'll talk about that later. Also, the fact that every state gets at least one representative, no matter what, that also distorts the numbers. And then finally, that the Senate is a statewide and everybody election, and every state gets two, no matter what. So that's going to give a huge advantage to lesser populated states. And so typically we see then, for example, certain parties do better in those states. They may be overrepresented then in the Senate in a way. I'm speaking overrepresented in terms of population, right? They're not really reflecting where the majority of the country may be, but because the way in which those members are selected, it's going to seem like they're a majority, right? So just understand that the way in which members are elected to their offices also affects whether or not we have divided government. And it doesn't always tell you who the majority of the people actually want.
All right, so there are times when we see a major shift in party affiliation, and when this occurs, when there's either could be a sudden shift or a gradual shift. In either case, we call this a realignment. So just think about that term, realigning, changing alignment, changing allegiance from one group to the other. So we see this after oftentimes with a critical election. So in a critical election, most famous being 1932 with Franklin Roosevelt, where you saw a major shift in voting behavior and a major shift towards the Democratic Party. So you had, for instance, what we call the New Deal coalition was formed, and you had African Americans and Southern whites and sort of socially conscious people in the Northeast, and liberals. You had workers like labor unions, and things like that, that all started voting Democratic, and it was as you see here, a permanent or a long-lasting shift from Republican to Democrat. And then you saw the Democrats then go on to win the presidency. Roosevelt was elected 4 times, and then Truman was elected after that. So it can also occur within certain demographic groups. So it can be sort of a gradual shift within a certain group who votes one way for one party and then gradually shifts to the other. For example, white Southerners used to be very solid, very reliable voters for the Democratic Party, but in recent decades, they've shifted gradually to the Republican Party, and now white Southerners are very reliable voters for the Republicans. So that would be what we'd call a secular realignment. The one with the New Deal realignment is called a party realignment, where it's a massive shift across from one party to the other. Anyway, so you can also see the Northeast at the same time as the South shifted to Republican, especially white Southerners. The Northeast has seen a shift, whereas they used to be reliable Republican voters, now they're reliable Democratic voters. We also see a trend of what's called dealignment. So this is a decline in party identification overall amongst the electorate. So we've talked about this where we see an increasing number of independents. So at least 1/3 of the population at least claims to be independent. Like we said, sometimes if you really press people, they will say they lean towards one party or the other. But just the fact that people don't feel as closely tied to parties is significant. And we've talked about, again, how parties have weakened, and they're still very powerful, and they still are dominant in our political system, but they certainly aren't as controlling or as powerful as they used to be, during the so-called golden age. Okay, so in general, we see a weakening of party allegiance amongst the electorate.
Parties want to identify their followers and target them with messaging that is going to resonate with them. So they're going to tailor their messaging to interests for that particular individual because there's a higher likelihood that person then will respond and also feel like the party is indeed responsive to them, right? Increasing their sense of political efficacy, right? So this is really an important component of what a party does, because they want to, of course, make sure that their members, the people who support them, are coming out in force and they feel listened to. So you can see here that communication technology and voter data management have greatly assisted with this effort. You saw in particular in the 2012 election, and prior to that election, really. But in 2012, it was sort of a very interesting case study because the Obama campaign had remarkably, been able to capitalize on its data management computer software in a way that led them to success. This program was codenamed Project Narwhal, and essentially it set out to gather information about voters and micro-target their messaging. For example, if a voter they knew had expressed sympathies towards Planned Parenthood, well, then they would probably send them a lot of messages about pro-choice issues or pro-choice candidates, giving them the sense that the party is really attuned to what they think is important. Imagine someone who was very environmentally conscious or concerned about climate change, then a lot of the messages that would go to them would be targeted towards environmentally conscious issues or sensitive issues. And this micro-targeting was remarkable, and you saw it used to great effectiveness, to great effect, rather, on behalf of the Obama campaign. Romney tried to, catch up to the Obama campaign in terms of their data management and computer software programs with the micro-targeting of messages. His particular campaigns management software was named Orca. It was codenamed Orca, but it never really performed at the levels of of the Obama campaign's Narwhal, if you will, program. Nonetheless, what this shows you is that parties have had to become more sophisticated in how they reach out to their voters. As their voters and as the public becomes more media and social media savvy, the parties have had to also meet their voters where they are. In other words, they've had to become very much more savvy in terms of social media and in terms of communications technology in general, and how they use voter data to target their messages to their voters. And we see this being used to great effect. The flip side is true too. We've seen that communication technology and data management systems have also meant that it's leveled the playing field. And what do I mean by that? In the prior slide, you could see how the political party could maintain discipline and make sure that voters are loyal to it and follow its messaging and so on. And also the parties would, leverage these data troves of information, because a lot of this is information that the party can control and determine whether or not they're going to give a candidate access to. So, for example, a lot of this data could be data about voters who typically vote for Democrats and what issues they like. But if the party wanted to make sure that its candidates are on message or do what they tell them to do, they could say, hey, if you play nicely with us, then we'll give you all this information. And that's one way in which parties can maintain discipline. Also, it's one way that they can also make sure that the messaging that's going out to the rest of the nation is also consistent. But on the other hand, you can see insurgent candidates use data management and communication technology systems to, if you will, begin a insurgent candidacy. And what do I mean by that? A candidate that the party does not support. So during the primary process, you can have two Democrats or two Republicans that are trying to vie for being the actual Democrat or the actual Republican who will represent the party on the general ticket ballot. And that's the final ballot that will determine who then becomes that representative and who gets to represent those people in office. But the point of the matter here is that you can see some examples over here to the right with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, as well as the Tea Party. Both of those are examples, if you will, these images are examples of insurgents. In other words, people who decided to run, who the party did not endorse, but they had a lot of grassroots, meaning they had a lot of support in their communities for their candidacy, and they decided to run anyway. And part of the reason they were able to be successful is because social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook and and various other ways that you can fundraise. Now you can get a lot of people who don't have as much money because you can reach out to many more of them. Their small donations add up, and so then you can compete with the big dogs. And so the advent of communication technology has allowed for insurgent candidates to succeed, even without the support from the national party, thereby making politics much more candidate-centered rather than just who the party says you should vote for. So the national parties are headed by a chair. You can see here Tom Perez is the national chair for the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, and Ronna Romney McDaniel is the chair for the Republican National Committee. Now, you should note that with respect to the chair of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, because he's president and he's from the Republican Party, he gets to usually pick who the chair is. In other words, whomever has the presidency, whichever party has the presidency, the president then will determine who the chair of the national committee is. And so you can understand, you probably can rightfully infer that the national committee chair becomes also, to some extent, an extension of the president, right? And the messaging the president wants to send out there.
Just, you may notice the name Romney, and that, yes, Mitt Romney was the Republican nominee for president in 2012. So she is, I believe, his niece. That's what we found out. That, yes, so she is related to Mitt Romney, who's now going to be a senator from Utah. Okay, so one of the big events that the National Party Committee is in charge of is putting on their national convention, holding the national convention, organizing it, raising money for it, etc. And so every 4 years, the Democrats and Republicans hold their national convention. And there's a couple of goals that they have, or reasons why they have the national convention. The traditional reason, or the main, technically the main reason, is to nominate your candidate for president and vice president. So you have, we'll talk again more in the elections PowerPoint, but basically each state holds a series of contests that either are primaries or caucuses, and you're trying to win delegates by winning those contests. And so you win delegates to the convention who come to the convention from the various states and territories, and they're there to represent you and to vote for you. Barack Obama, you see here at his convention, or Mitt Romney when he was nominated by the Republicans in 2012. And so you have delegates, and so you have other candidates who gather delegates and win delegates, but ultimately one nominee is chosen for president and the nominee for vice president. That's become more of a formality. It used to be that at the national convention there was real drama between the party, as far as the party leaders and who they might pick as their nominee. But today it's basically a foregone conclusion. So in some ways, the convention then takes on more of a role of like a pep rally or a celebration of the candidate rather than simply the nomination. And so it's usually 4 days long, 4 or 5 days long. Yeah. And so you see, especially at the last couple of nights of the convention, usually on the night before the final night, you have the vice presidential candidate accepts their party's nomination and gives a speech, and then there's a keynote address and other speakers from the party and celebrities, etc. But then on the final night, the final big event is the acceptance speech by the presidential nominee from that party, where they accept their party's nomination. And then you can see usually that's followed by a big, huge balloon drop. And thousands and thousands of balloons.
Sometimes so it's really, it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yes, yeah. And so it's basically becomes then a chance to sell your candidate to the rest of the country. But it's also another thing they do earlier in the convention is to come up with their party's platform, which we've talked about already. But so the platform is developed by a platform committee of top party activists and members. And so they come up with their party platform and nominate their candidate, and it's a big celebration.
The other thing, just to add a couple things here, is that typically these conventions take place at the tail end of August or the beginning of September. And this is after all the primaries have been conducted, right? All 50 states have done their primaries, including, in fact, I think some of the territories do primaries as well. But then there's this July period, the month of July, sort of like a lull. It allows the candidates to sort of get assembled and get started in earnest with their candidacy and their campaign rather to become president. The other thing I wanted to note was that the DNC and RNC chairs, I mentioned to you that if your party has the president is the person who chooses the chair. If they don't, it means that the committee will vote. A larger committee of the party elite will determine who the chair is. I also want to mention that when you don't have the president in your party, you then the chair of the party is technically the leader of the party, right? In other words, they are the spokesperson for the party. But when the president is in your party, they are typically, they're typically considered the spokesperson for the party. So just keep that in mind as well in terms of messaging and how things work. So the political party structure, as we mentioned already, that the parties compete on all levels of government, national, state, and local. You can get a sense from this structure how it is, designed and how it is structured, for that matter, organized. You can get a sense also of what kind of events take place at what levels and what kind of individuals may be found or types of members we may find at each level. Right? And so both major parties are represented by a national committee, the DNC and RNC. We already talked about those, the Democratic National Committee and the Republican National Committee. But the parties are largely decentralized, with committees in each state and in many counties across the U.S. And what that means is that even though there is a national Democratic committee and there's a national Republican committee, every single state also has a Democratic committee and a Republican committee. And so they sometimes will go right along with what the national party wants them to do or say. But sometimes they may march to the beat of their own drum. There are occasions when the state party and the national party don't see eye to eye. One of these instances came up during a dispute over when certain primaries should take place. We'll talk about that more in the elections PowerPoint, but suffice it to say that states like Florida and Nevada, their parties, it was a very interesting situation. You had the Republican and Democrats from those states actually banding together against the Republicans and Democrats on the national level. It was a very weird situation, but nonetheless, something we'll go into more detail in the elections PowerPoint. Suffice it to say, too, that some states' committees, so for example, you can imagine that the Democratic Tennessee, or the committee of Democrats that run Tennessee are going to be much more conservative than the national party. And so there may be some things the national party wants them to do or say that the Tennessee Democrats would decide, no, that's not really where we are, or we're not really emphasizing that. The flip side is true. I mean, on the other hand, you could imagine that New York Republicans are much more liberal, perhaps, than the Republican Party as a whole. And so there are things that the Republicans in New York, the state committees won't say or do, the state committee won't say or do that the national party wants them to do. So there can be differences here that also mirror the ideologies of these various committees on the state level too. Notice that a lot of on the state level, that's where a lot of your organizational party will come from. So a lot of your activists, a lot of the people who do the groundwork, they're going to come from this slate of people who work on the state level. The national level, you're going to have many more of your show horses. These are the persons who are on the news a lot, or spokespeople, and the leadership. On the local level, of course, is your grassroots. Basically, these are a lot of your, party and the electorate for sure, but this is also going to be various activists and volunteers that work on a local level. So just keep in mind these various levels and structures and what kind of activities likely happen on each level as well.
Right. So just from a practical standpoint, so again, you have the National Democratic Committee or Republican National Committee. You have the Republican Party of Georgia, the Democratic Party of Georgia, but then you also have the Republican Party of Cobb County and the Democratic Party of Cobb County. So you see, these different levels. Okay, so now our last topic here is the topic of third parties. So in the United States, it sounds like some people might think, oh, a third party. So there's the Republicans, Democrats, and there's some other party. No, the third party is any of the other parties, really, other than the Republicans and Democrats. So any party that exists in the United States that's not the Republicans or Democrats, that's not one of the major parties, they're all classified as third parties. So there's multiple third parties. You see here this hat also saying Republican and Demoblican, which I guess is also pointing to the fact that sometimes people are attracted to third parties because they feel like the two main parties don't really actually give them a significant choice, that they tend to be too similar, and they don't really speak to people who don't agree on some of those commonly held principles of the two parties. For example, that both parties generally support a fairly large military, or both parties, generally are support the capitalist system. That both parties support corporate interests and things like that. So that's the argument of some of the other third parties, is that, or people who vote third parties say neither party really, not only do they not speak to their issues, but they feel like there's actually no real difference. And so they're trying to send a message by voting third party, or simply just showing that they don't like the two parties. So again, we talked about at the very beginning, you see here some of the major third parties of the United States. This is not meant to be all-inclusive, but these are some of the parties that are currently in existence in the United States. Some have been around longer than others. You have the Libertarian Party. We see a lot here in the South. We see them on the ballot frequently in Georgia. We've talked about what libertarianism means. Basically, the absence, not lack of, but limitations on government. So less government, small government party across the board. The modern Whig Party, which is interesting because it's a sort of a revival of the old Whigs, the Whigs of the 1830, was it 30s, 40s, 50s? Mm-hmm. And so the modern Whig Party appears to take a very centrist position on a lot of issues, sort of in between the Republicans and Democrats, more of a party that seeks compromise between Americans. And then you have the Green Party, which is the Green Party originated in Europe, I believe, they were environmentalists, and now it's become sort of a more of a democratic socialist party in a sense. They're very much, they're to the left of the Democratic Party, but maybe not quite as far left as the Socialist Party of the United States. And so they are pro-environment, but they're also, of course, pro-choice and pro-gay rights, and they want universal health care and things like that. So in a lot of ways, the Socialist Party and the Green Party probably share a lot of similar positions. I think the Socialist Party wants even more of a dismantling of the capitalist system, public ownership of corporations, things like that. You have the Communist Party, which has been around for a long time in the United States, but it doesn't have a lot of followers. As we mentioned, they're sort of too far left, I would say, for most Americans. And then you have the Constitution Party is on the right. So they're even more conservative than the Republican Party. And so you can look up their websites if you're interested.
Probably too far
more information
to the right for most Americans.
Yeah, so they're too far to the right to appeal to many Americans. And then you have the Reform Party, which basically was created by the followers of Ross Perot, who ran for president in 1992 and in 1996. The Reform Party basically, again, takes sort of a centrist position. They're sort of conservative economically, but they don't take a stand really on social issues. So they're interesting in the sense that they don't really feel like, they don't get bogged down in sort of the arguments over things like abortion. Instead, they focus mainly on economic issues and government reform. Okay, so third parties, why don't they succeed in the United States? So let's look at some of the reasons, some of the obstacles that they face. And none of these are not in any particular order, but all of these things work against the success of third parties. One of them is simply ballot access. And so remember, the Republicans and Democrats control the levers of power and of the government. And so every state is run by either a Republican or a Democratic majority. And the two parties, in a sense, will work together to make sure that they're the two that stay on top. And they get to set the laws on ballot access, right? So when they pass laws at the state level, because remember, states run their own elections, they set the rules for how you get on the ballot. So most states, essentially, the rules will say you automatically get on the ballot if you're a Democratic or Republican candidate. So if the party nominates, the Democratic or Republican party nominates someone for the House or Senate, for example, they are guaranteed to appear on the ballot. Whereas if you're a third party candidate, they may say, well, if you didn't get at least, 10 or 15% of the vote in the last election, then you don't automatically get placed on the ballot. And so they have to jump through all sorts of hoops, like usually have to get a petition, and they might have to acquire thousands of signatures of people who say they want them to be on the ballot. They have to fill out paperwork, maybe pay fees, meet filing deadlines. And it's just very, very much more difficult for them to get their candidates even on the ballot.
The other issue that third parties face is that they just simply don't have enough money to compete with the two major parties, as the, if you will, gates of campaign finance have been opened even wider as a result. In other words, in terms of the amount of money that floods our political system due to the Citizens United court case and other legislation and court rulings as well, we've seen that money can have a huge impact as to who wins an election in terms of getting their message out, in terms of getting negative campaigns out or messaging out against your opponent. And so third parties, because they've typically been losers, in other words, I shouldn't say it that way, but they've lost, if you will, elections mostly in prior election cycles. They typically want to back winners or a group that has at least a chance of winning. And many people don't see third parties as having much of a chance of winning. So in some ways, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because they don't get the money as a result of their past performance, but because they lack the money, they will continuously face a very steep uphill battle to even be able to win at all, ever. But the point of the matter here being is that you'll see that a lot of the money is sent to the two parties because it would be seen as wasteful to send it to one of the third parties since they hardly ever win. Also, you can see that as far as public funding is concerned, that means funding that comes from the government. Third parties typically are shut out of this as well because the threshold is rather high for them, where they have to garner at least 5% of the popular vote in the prior election in order to be eligible to receive public funding. And so for this is another major reason that third parties typically don't succeed in our election system.
Okay, so the structure of our elections are another major obstacle to third parties, and there's a lot of important terms here that you need to understand. Sometimes we use the term first past the post, or other elections, you could say winner take all. Essentially, in the case that the person who gets the most votes, sometimes not even, it doesn't have to be even a majority, but it depends on the laws of that state. But it could be that you win 40% of the vote, but you win the election. That's called first past the post. So you could actually have 60% of the voters who wanted someone else, but you win that office because of the rules of the way our elections are set up, right? So this encourages a two-party system because the party that finishes third, not to mention the party that finishes second, gets nothing. And so you also see the fact that the House of Representatives is divided into, as we mentioned before, single-member districts. Again, every district, there's 435 House voting, seats of voting members in the House, and those 435 seats are divided around the country. Each district elects one person. So again, if you finish second or third for that seat, you get nothing. So this would be in contrast to European systems that we said a lot of them are multi-party systems, where you often see a proportional voting system where the candidate who, in other words, they may vote nationally, and let's say a party, let's say the Republican Party nationally received a total of 35% of the vote, and the Democratic Party received, 40% of the vote, and maybe the Libertarians received, 10% of the national vote, and the Green Party received, 7% of the national vote, etc. And if that were the case, they would then divvy up the seats in the legislature. Let's say it's a parliament. You would get seats in the parliament roughly equal to the percentage of the vote that you received nationally, or it could still be district by district, but the seats would be divided proportionally. And so anyway, that in that system, you can see how third parties would actually fare much better, because even if you finish second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, etc., you may, with like 8 or 10% of the vote, you may still win at least some seats in the legislature, which then gives you some voice over the laws that are passed and can give you bargaining power. And so in those countries, people are more encouraged to vote for third parties as opposed to ours, where they feel like they're wasting their vote, which we'll look at in a second.
One of the other challenges for third parties is that they just, hold views that do not fit in line with or align very well with where the majority of Americans are, at least not yet, right? I mean, it could change, but the point of the matter is that at that point in time, their views are maybe too far to the left or too far to the right, and they just don't appeal to as many people.
Okay, so this one again is one of those self-fulfilling prophecies or vicious cycles where people don't vote for third parties because they feel like they're wasting their vote. And the way our election system is set up, they probably are, because even if everyone voted the true way that they wanted to, voted their heart, the third parties would still often come up short. But like we said, in a proportional system, that you don't have to win to actually get votes. But so anyway, in other words, people don't vote for third parties because they feel like they're not going to win. But then, of course, they never win because people don't vote for them. So it's hard to say which causes the other. But now, what we could do, and what some states like Maine are doing, is using what's called a ranked choice voting system. And in that case, you would vote, let's say you really like the Libertarian candidate, or you really like the Green Party candidate or Socialist candidate. You could still vote for them, and you would vote them as your number one choice for that office. So let's say it's a race for the Senate, and you vote, your number one choice is Green Party. Your second choice might be Democratic Party, and your third choice might be Libertarian, and your fourth choice might be Republican, or whatever it is, right? And then if no candidate gets above 50% of the vote, then they eliminate the bottom finisher. They eliminate the fourth place finisher, let's say, or the third place finisher, depending on how many candidates there were. And then they shift that person's votes, who was their second choice. So voters who voted Green Party, they would then look to say who was their second choice, and they would shift those votes accordingly. And if that doesn't put someone over the top, right, then they would keep going up the list of candidates. Anyway, so basically you avoid the runoff that we see in Georgia oftentimes. In Georgia, if no one gets the majority, they have a runoff. But again, people without this ranked choice, people are discouraged from actually voting their first choice sometimes because they think they're not going to win.
And another vicious cycle sort of feeds into this as well, the lack of media coverage. A lot of third-party candidates get very little attention from the media at all, especially sometimes they're just excluded from debates altogether unless they're polling at a certain level or better. And this, of course, is going to amplify the problems they have and set in motion a vicious cycle, because one of the reasons they're unable to be successful is they don't get as much attention, and because the media refuses to cover them, they're just reinsuring that they will continuously not get enough attention, and thereby marginalizing them and relegating them to the margins of the political process. Now, of course, it is, there are things that third party candidates can do to sort of break through, but that would require, sometimes somebody being independently very wealthy, like Ross Perot. That's one of the reasons he was able to be successful as a third party candidate, was because he was a billionaire. So he could self-finance. But if you aren't able to self-finance, you would have to be an extraordinary candidate, or there is some sort of extraordinary event. In other words, all the stars would have to align in a way for you to break through. And so this once again is one of those issues and dynamics that's true about our political system that makes it even more difficult for third-party candidates to be able to gain any traction in our electoral process.
Right, because some of the third-party candidates in the past who have had success, like Mr. Davila said, they're either personally wealthy, like Ross Perot, or they're sort of celebrities, or have like some type of a sense of cult of personality. You had Jesse Ventura, who won the governor's race in Minnesota as a Reform Party candidate, but he was a former professional wrestler, WWE or whatever. So like people knew who he was. He was a celebrity. Anyway, so you had Teddy Roosevelt was the most successful third-party candidate ever to run for president, but he had also previously been president of the United States when he ran. And I just noticed that I have a 5 and a 5, so excuse that, but should be, of course, lack of media coverage is reason number 6. But anyway, so so people oftentimes are attracted to an individual candidate, but then that doesn't last beyond that actual election, or that particular election. Okay, so the importance of third parties. There's one major role they can play or difference they can make is essentially changing the outcome of an election. And this is often not their intention, but they could play a spoiler role. And that would mean they don't win, but they siphon votes or take votes away from another party in a close election, which actually could change the outcome. This is another problem of that first past the post principle of elections, or the problem of not having, say, ranked choice voting, because what ends up happening, let's say with Ralph Nader in 2000, remember in 2000 was one of those elections where George Bush was elected, but he had fewer votes. He lost the popular vote to Al Gore, and it came down to the state of Florida was the decisive state. Whoever won Florida was going to win the election. It was so close that they had to go through a long legal battle with recounts, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the case was finally decided in favor of Bush, in Bush v. Gore. But anyway, in Florida, the final difference between Bush and Gore was estimated to be about 500 votes, which is just infinitesimal, amount when you're talking about millions of votes being cast. And so 500 votes. Well, I believe Ralph Nader won about 80,000 votes in Florida that year. And so you take 80,000. Well, who are Ralph Nader? He ran as the Green Party candidate, I believe, in that election. And he therefore was running on a platform that was to the left of the Democrats, to the left of Al Gore. Now, like I said, people who supported the Green Party would say, well, we just simply didn't want to vote for Al Gore. Maybe they didn't like his positions. But if you really are honest about it, you would say that the Green Party candidates, if they had done the ranked choice voting, who was their second choice? And the majority of them probably would have preferred Al Gore rather than George Bush, who had a more conservative view on the issue. So, by by voting for Green Party, that's perfectly their right as voters. But which candidate did they end up helping, and which candidate did they end up hurting? Well, by voting Green Party, they actually helped the candidate with which they probably disagree the most, and they hurt the candidate that they agree with, they actually agree with more than the other. So in the case of these outcomes, the third party voters end up with a candidate who is probably their least favorite candidate of the choices.
One of the other impacts or importance of a third party is they can introduce new policies and ideas. So sometimes third parties are, they have correctly identified an issue that is resonating with the public. And, whether it be something like the balanced budget with Ross Perot in 1992, or the women's right to vote with the progressive parties and socialist parties, whatever it may be that they have properly detected an interest in, is also ripe territory or fertile ground for the parties, the two major parties, to pay attention to that and then co-opt that message. So sometimes the two major parties realize that the third parties are onto something, and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, we're for that too. And indeed incorporate it into their platform in order to attract those voters. In doing so, of course, that relegates the third parties once again to a minor status and marginalizes them, because the two major parties now have sort of taken away some of their thunder as a result of adopting those new policies or ideas. But it is a dynamic process that allows for new ideas and policies to be introduced via the method of a third party sort of advocating for that particular point of view or issue. And then finally, you can see the increase in voter choice and the check on power of the main parties. In other words, third parties, there are people who truly believe in the ideas and the set of ideas that this third party represents, and therefore they want to have this other choice, especially if they are disgusted with or disenchanted with the two major parties. It gives the public an ability to register their discontent with the two major parties too, when they want to express frustration in a way that's not violent, right, through the peaceful means of the ballot box. And you can see that ultimately it's a check on the power of the main parties if they overstep or they misinterpret their mandate. In other words, how much power or how much support they really have. This is one way that voters can remind them, hey, we don't really support all of these things, or you as much as you think we do.
And ultimately, not only does it act as a check, but the third parties actually, they have that dream that someday they may be, one of the main parties. They may actually start to compete and win elections. And so we see isolated cases where third parties have won statewide elections and so forth. So it's not unrealistic. Now, the Republicans actually started it, as a third party. So when the Whig Party was in decline, the Republicans started out as a third party, mainly focused on anti-slavery or expansion of slavery. They were against the expansion of slavery, and so and then here they started in the 1850s, and by 1860, Abraham Lincoln had been elected president. So there is that dream, that hope and dream that someday maybe we'll be one of the main parties. Okay, so that ends our presentation, and so you guys hopefully took some good notes, and you'll be ready for that quiz.
Thank you for listening.